Download our free report, What Buyers Want from Photographers, a survey of 500 photo editors and buyers telling you how they find new images and talent at photoshelter.com/mkt/research.
Hi, everybody.
So, hey, um, Ashley Macknica, well, she actually worked at PhotoShelter in 2007 and 2008, but I mean, this is a pretty interesting resume because you worked both as a photo editor, you also worked as an editorial agent selling images. Now you're working as a photographer and a freelance editor for New York Magazine, which is a huge consumer of photography and photographers.
Yes,
Which is
sure is.
fantastic. So tell us a little bit about the portfolio drop-off. How do people get in touch with people like you?
Well, I think the portfolio drop-off is sort of an old school convention that is useful for that very reason. It lets the editor know that you are aware of the industry and the expectation of having a printed portfolio or an iPad portfolio or something to show. So I think it's a good sort of way of just communicating that you know the conventions of the industry. And then more than that, it's a way of kind of building a relationship with the editor. If you can actually get in to meet them, that's even better, but a lot of times people don't have the time. So it's something that you can just drop them an email and kind of find out when their portfolio drop-off date is, because some magazines have a certain day and a time, but sometimes they just take them on a rolling basis. So it's kind of a good way to start the conversation, I think. And then whether you might get a response telling you that this is the day and time that we do it, or whenever is fine, and then that'll really give the editor a heads up that they should be looking for your book, and then it gives you another reason to kind of drop them another email and say, hey, thanks so much for taking a look. So it's sort of, I think, a really good relationship builder.
So I have a very practical question, which is obviously there's a ton of photographers out there of varying skill levels. How do you know whether you're even in the ballpark? You're out there, you're pounding the pavement. Your images might be really terrible and not appropriate for that magazine. How do you even get that sense?
Right. I think the best thing to do is, if you want to be a magazine photographer, you have to spend a lot of time looking at magazines. You just have to. You have to be aware of what's out there in the world and what everyone is looking at. And then from there, you can kind of hone in on what you're attracted to, what photos you see and you think, I wish I took that photo. I could take that photo. And then you kind of start to compare yourself to that. And, it's not as much about like copying, but it's important to build on the existing imagery that's out there and being aware of it.
Here's another slide, market in multiple media. So your 2 points here, repetitive exposure. If I hear your name from different sources, I'm more likely to recall it under pressure. And brand consistency, maintain your brand across email, direct mail, newsletter, website. So I assume you're looking at all of these different media to find talent, and the more that you see them in all these different places, the better likelihood that you'll remember them.
Yeah, especially when you're in a situation as an editor where you might have a couple hours to put a shoot together and it needs to happen the next day. And you don't have time to research every photographer that's out there that might be 100% perfect and come up with your ideal list. It might sometimes just be a matter of like who comes to mind, who would be good, and whose style or brand, as it's used in this way, is a match for the assignment. So the more times that you hear somebody's name or start to recognize them as a brand for their photography, then the more likely you are to think of that name in that like panic mode when it's 5 o'clock and you're like, who am I going to hire to do this? I just don't have time to think too hard about it. So I think there's something to be said for hearing the name in a bunch of different venues and not really even knowing exactly why you think of their name first, but you just do.
You know, you said on the previous slide as one of the points, like, be nice. We hear these sort of
Yeah.
apocryphal tales about the, you know, the incorrigible celebrity photographer. But is it the case that on, you know, the average assignment when you're trying to find an image or find a photographer, does personality matter to you? Like, if you're choosing between three people, you're like, that person's the nicest, I'd like to work with them.
Oh, definitely. I think it's a lot about that. You want to, you know, if you're given three photographers that are all otherwise technically equal and stylistically equal, and you know one of them is going to be friendly and make everyone feel comfortable and not grumpy, then you're definitely going to choose that person every time, because it's still, in the reality of it, it's a day that you're spending with other people. It's not just an image that's made in a vacuum in someone's office alone. You know, it's a collaboration.
Right, right. Photography blogs. I know you love some of these photography blogs. So some of your favorites: Humble Arts Foundation, which is a group here in New York City; I Heart Photograph; tinyvices.com. Tell us a little bit about how you're finding talent and keeping in touch with talent through blogs.
Well, those sites, there's a bunch of great photo sites, and those are kind of my personal favorites that stylistically match what I'm drawn to, but there's a lot of other ones depending on the style, or, you know, there's a lot more documentary-based ones, but I think that it's fun for editors to peruse through these sites on a daily basis. It's kind of, I know a lot of editors have them in their regular news feed, and it feels like you're researching your field, but it's not work, because you're getting insight into new photographers that you might not have heard of before, and especially international photographers or people that are located somewhere else. It's just, I think it's a fun part of research, and it's something that didn't exist until recently. So I think it's a really powerful tool.
So these, you know, a lot of these sites are aggregation sites, right? They're basically curated photo blog sites. Do you think it makes sense for the photographers, therefore, as a part of their marketing activity, to sort of reach out to the, you know, these types of sites depending on the type of work they're trying to get, and try to be covered?
It definitely does. I think it should, but these sites, like you said, depending on what kind of work they do, but there is a handful of sites for probably every kind of specialization. But I think that the people responsible for them should be sort of treated the same as a photo editor at a magazine or an art buyer, in that they are sort of arbiters of the industry and what's going on in both art and commercial photography right now.
And do you pay attention to photo contests?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the PDN 30 is always something editors are aware of. So that's one that comes to mind. But I think that contest winners, even if I'm not aware that I'm getting that information, I think it's another way of getting your name out there. Sort of goes back to that multiple ways of marketing. Like, it's another name recognition, that kind of thing.
Right.
I do think that photo contests are important in that way.
So for the audience, both Whitney and Ashley mentioned the PDN 30, which is the Photo District News 30. They select 30 emerging photographers per year, and their website is pdnonline.com. Magazine research. You regularly research other magazines for inspiration to find photographers and ideas and see who's shooting what. What types of magazines are you looking at to get inspiration?
Ooh, good question. I like looking at everything. I'm kind of just limited by either my budget or how long the storekeeper will let me sit around reading their magazines for free. But I've always loved New York Magazine, and they do such a great job of hiring so many different photographers each week. And also, I think it's important to keep abreast of what's going on in the fashion magazines if you're remotely interested in fashion. And I think it's good to be aware of trends, even if you're not trying to be a fashion photographer, but maybe you're trying to shoot still life, because you might be hired to shoot accessories, and it's important to know what's on trend for that reason. So I think it's worth picking up magazines like, Vogue and French Vogue, and even indie magazines like Le Officiel and all those. But otherwise, for myself, I love travel and leisure, actually, and I'm trying to think of what other ones I'm drawn to. I think there's, trying to think.
New York Magazine, even though you work there, I love that magazine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I can pretty much sit down with any magazine, and I'm always looking at the other credits. So,
Subject-specific searches. Some assignments require the expertise of a photographer known for being in a certain place or specializing in a certain type of subject.
Yeah.
Talk to us about how you try to find sort of niche photographers or niche. Is there room for the generalist photographer out there, in your opinion?
I think there's less room than there used to be, especially if you're in a place like New York where there are a lot of photographers. But I think there's more room for a general photographer when their location can be sort of their specialty, because a lot of times there will be an assignment in a very specific location, and there might not be a budget to fly a photographer there, or it just makes more sense to hire somebody who is familiar with the location. So I think when your location is part of your assets, that should be something that you really try to capitalize on and make sure that that's searchable, and that your name pops up when someone is searching for photographers in your area, which might mean getting your name in local magazines or local newspapers, because those all are other ways that you can wind up being searchable.
So I have two great questions from the audience. The first is, and you've worked at these very hip magazines, do you think there's an unspoken age barrier that exists, or are you generally unaware of, how old the photographer is and what they've done?
Do you mean an age, like an upper age barrier or a lower age barrier?
An upper age barrier, like ageism, basically, like an older guy's going to have trouble getting a job with certain magazines?
Right. I mean, I think it could work both ways, because I think that young photographers are disadvantaged in that they don't have the personal connections, they don't have the experience to make the editor feel confident that they know what will be produced from the shoot. So there's that, but then there is that cool factor, I suppose, with young photographers.
Right.
So I think there's benefits to all age ranges, and especially now where a lot of photographers are hired without ever even being face-to-face with the editors, that it doesn't matter quite as much as the experience being spot on. I think you could be a 90-year-old fashion photographer as long as you're doing your research and staying relevant.
Do you have a preference about working with reps or through reps versus working directly with photographers?
I think it's usually more appealing to work with a photographer directly for certain reasons. I mean, that feeling that you're supporting someone. Art is a little bit more present when you're working with them directly, and you just have that relationship with them. But there are certain ways that it can be easier to work through an agent, especially when you're handling a bigger production and there's a lot of logistics involved that photographers themselves may not be the best suited to handle. So I think
Right.
it can depend on, you know, the scale of the job or the nature of the job.
So going back to promos for a second, here is one by a photographer that we both know, Emiliano Granado, who's based here in New York City. And this is an email promo that he created that we split into two halves just so it would fit. And tell us why you like this one so much.
I like this because, well, first of all, what Emiliano does is he will, before he even sends out his newsletter, he will send out alerts through Facebook or his own email contact, every way to encourage people to sign up for his newsletter, which I really like because it makes you feel like you're getting some kind of insider access to something. You're kind of, he's inviting you to be a part of this project that he's working on, which is his newsletter. So I think that's a really good first start before he's even sending the newsletter. And then when it comes, you feel like you requested it. So I personally take more time to look at it because it's something I asked for. And he's got sort of a couple of different projects that show a range of what he's been up to lately. And just it feels personal, and there's some kind of narrative with each of the images, and it just kind of reminds you what he's up to, and it makes it feel like you've got a little phone call from him or an update. So I think it's really successful.
Let's take a look at some other pieces you worked on. This is from Jane magazine.
Yes, and this is a photographer who specializes in portraits of, she does a lot of portraits of people in their homes or in different environments. So based on her work, that was a really kind of appropriate assignment for her.
So what was involved in this when you were you choosing amongst a few photographers? Was location a factor? Was the rate a factor? How did you end up with this particular photographer?
This photographer is Isabel Asha Penslian, who she is somebody that we had built a kind of long-term relationship with at Jane magazine. So she's somebody that was known for doing great sort of natural light portraiture, and also kind of speaking to what we were discussing earlier about that on-set personality, and just knowing that she relates well with the subjects and is very respectful, and all those things that go into making the day go smoothly. And in terms of the location, this particular portrait is about this girl and where she works. So we sent a scout to take photos of the actual location and see what it looks like. So then Isabel, the photographer, could kind of get a sense for what it might look like ahead of time. So we all kind of collaborate in that way. And then usually there would be someone from the magazine on set kind of helping to make sure that it was going in the right direction, and just being on set for advice.
Right. Here's another one, stylistically, obviously very, very different. Retro aerobics.
Yeah, I thought this was a good example of a photographer being hired based on their personal work. This photographer's name is Todd Seeley, and he has been doing a lot of kind of really energetic, hoppy nightlife photography, so we thought that this would be a great assignment for him. And I think that that's the best feeling as a photo editor, when you can hire someone for what they're already doing and that they're passionate about, because it just makes a better photo, and you can kind of capitalize on the skills that they've honed already by themselves.
Can you tell us a little bit, you're working at New York Magazine as a freelancer now. What's sort of the process, in terms of illustrating like a one-page story at the front of the magazine versus a feature story that might run 8 pages in the middle of the magazine? Are you guys thinking about budgets being allocated based on the length of the piece, or how do you determine whether you want to use a stock image versus a commission piece?
Right. Well, I'm actually not at the magazine right now, but it was a few weeks ago. But I can definitely speak to that. In terms of, you mean the size of the images, how they wind up being published in the end versus budget? Is that kind of what you're touching on?
I guess how you make a determination of whether you want to go to a photographer to find an image versus going to like a stock agency to find an image or commission the image.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right. I would say that in general, the stock for existing image research is always the first step, because I think Whitney kind of mentioned this as well, that you want to just see what's out there, just to even get a feel for what's already been published and what people might have already, they might be tired of seeing it shot a certain way if it's a location, or a certain story might be really oversaturated. So you want to see what's out there first for that reason, but then you might find something that you could actually publish. And again, like that's what PhotoShelter is great for. You can find people's personal work that might not have even been published before, or one was published, but there's a whole bunch of outtakes that weren't published that could work perfectly to illustrate the story. So, and particularly with it, it's always better to find something that you don't have to produce, because it's always going to be more expensive.
Right.
So I would say that's pretty much just the first step. And
Okay.
then can't find the exact right story, then you would move to producing a shoot.
And in terms of the stock outlets that you guys would typically use, I mean, obviously I've seen iStock photo images used as tiny thumbnails, to do like the approval matrix, which is a feature in the back of the magazine.
Right.
But
Right.
what other outlets are you using to find images for stock?
It's pretty much everything and anything. There's definitely, I think actually people are using Google image search more and more, and then you'll try to track down where it was originally published from your Google image search. I think that's like the first stop almost, and it's the easiest stop, but it's like if you don't do that, then you're kind of making more work for yourself. So I feel like that's
Right.
always a stop, and then potentially even Flickr, and then there's all this sort of standard stock resources. But if you have to illustrate something really specific, then you'll kind of go to the ends of the earth to find it. And it's sort of limited by how keyworded it is and how much time you have.
So we have another tear sheet here, a nice
yeah.
portrait of a woman.
Yes. So this is Anna Wolf, who I think also, I believe, was one of PDN's 30, as was, I think, Emiliano Granado. He was awarded for self-promotion, too. So that PDN 30 is definitely gets out there. Worth looking into. But this is another example of someone that did a lot of really beautiful portraits as part of her personal work. So it was a really nice match to have her shoot this.
Is there ever a situation where you guys go out specifically looking for a photographer who can also write? Or is it usually like photographers are photographers and writers are writers?
Yeah, I think, at least in my experience, the writers, I have seen text and photos purchased together as a set story, but I think it's fairly unusual, at least in the places that I've experienced, because you have the editors and the photo department, depending on the magazine. One will kind of initiate the story more than the other, but usually you want to have the staff writer involved. So I think it's hard. It's a little bit harder to find existing text and images that will work for a magazine and also be relevant in a timely manner. But I don't think it's impossible. I think it's just a little more rare.
Right. Here's a food shot. We've seen some portraits and some fashion, and now here's a food shot, which is making me really hungry.
I know, it's pretty good. So this is an example of photographer Marcus Nielsen, who, when we were doing a redesign at Jane, we saw a lot of his work in other magazines, and food was a new endeavor for the magazine. So we referenced other magazines to see who was shooting food and what photographers were the best at it. So that's kind of a good example of magazine research and how photo editors use that.
And then I think we have, that's our last one, but let's take a few more questions here. Whitney spent some time talking about the types of promos that she likes to see. Do you like these sort of handcrafted pieces that might have, 15 to 20 images in them? Or do you prefer kind of email, or what's your preference personally?
Email versus
a direct mail piece, or
right,
something that's very handcrafted.
I think editors get everything, and again, like what Whitney was saying, I completely agree that direct mail is something that is always going to get noticed. A physical piece of something in the mail you can't really ignore, and it's exciting. It stands out from the bills and the invoices, and especially if it's personalized with a note, or if it's something that's beautiful that you can hang up on your wall and kind of spruce up your cubicle a little bit. I think that definitely goes a long way. But I think they all kind of work together. It's all about that like multi-pronged approach of name recognition. I think that goes a long way.
Here's our last question, and it's a good one. So how do photographers find freelance photo editors to market to? So you're working periodically for these different, how should they reach out to you? So next time you're like, oh yeah, that guy takes good portraits.
That's a really good question. I don't know I've wondered that same thing myself, actually, and I don't know of a resource that specializes in freelance photo editors, but I do think that there are more and more of them nowadays than there used to be, and there should be some sort of resource for everybody to join together. But
in the meantime, just send cash to Ashley Macknica. Is that will that work?
Yeah, that'll work. Exactly.
Well, Ashley, thank you so much.
Have, like, a LinkedIn profile too.
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
You are listening to Ashley Macknica on how we hire photographers, and thanks to Ashley and Whitney Lawson for joining us today. If you haven't already downloaded our research, here it is, What Buyers Want from Photographers. It's our 2011 survey of over 500 buyers in all different types of industries. You can get it at photoshelter.com/mkt/research, and that's for free. So check it out, and of course, follow us on Twitter and friend us on Facebook.
Download our free report, What Buyers Want from Photographers, a survey of 500 photo editors and buyers telling you how they find new images and talent at photoshelter.com/mkt/research.